This is a game where I was outplayed for most of the middle game. My opponent had a winning position, and then, in a single move, gave it all away. One move. That's all it took to go from a lost position to checkmate on the board. Let me show you how it happened. This was a blitz game against ArecoM, rated 840, just 7 points below me. A Pirc defense setup, and a game that teaches one of the most important lessons in chess. It's never over until it's over. The game opens with pawn to e4, and my opponent replies with pawn to d6, heading into a Pirc defense structure. I play pawn to d4, claiming the center, and after pawn to a6, I develop naturally. Knight to f3, bishop to d3, knight to c3. My opponent sets up with pawn to e6, knight to f6, and bishop to e7. A solid but somewhat passive arrangement. I bring my bishop to e3, centralize my queen on d2, and castle queenside with castles kingside o. Through all of this, the position is comfortably in my favor, a slight edge for me. Both sides are developing, but I have a nice central presence, and my pieces are well coordinated. My opponent starts pushing on the queenside with pawn to b5, which is a natural idea against my queenside castling. The position is roughly balanced at this point. I push pawn to h4, beginning a kingside advance, and my opponent counters with pawn to c5, challenging my center. So far, a reasonable battle on both flanks. And here is where I make my first real mistake. I push pawn to h5. It looks aggressive, I'm trying to storm the kingside, but the engine says this hands my opponent a clear advantage. I've overextended, and the pawn push doesn't create the threats I was hoping for. This is a moment where ambition got ahead of calculation. From this point on, I'm on the back foot. My opponent plays pawn to b4, pushing my knight away, and I retreat it to e2. The position gives my opponent a slight edge. My opponent develops the bishop to b7, and I reroute my knight to g3, trying to find activity on the king side. My opponent plays knight to g4, putting pressure on my bishop on e3. I continue pushing with pawn to h6, and my opponent blocks with pawn to g6. The evaluation is now a clear advantage for my opponent. I'm struggling to find a constructive plan, and my kingside advance has left weaknesses rather than creating real threats. Now I play knight to g5, and this makes things significantly worse. The position goes from a clear advantage for my opponent to a winning position for my opponent. I'm trying to create complications, but the engine sees right through it. This was another slip. I'm now in serious trouble. My opponent captures my bishop on e3 with knight takes e3, and I recapture with queen takes e3. Then my opponent's bishop takes my knight on g5 with bishop takes g5. The dust settles, and I've lost a bishop and a knight in these exchanges, while my opponent has lost a knight. I'm down material. I try pawn to f4, hoping to challenge the bishop, and my opponent takes on d4 with the c-pawn. I recapture with queen takes d4. The position is winning for my opponent throughout all of this. I'm just trying to survive. My opponent plays bishop takes f4, check, capturing another pawn and giving check. I move my king to b1. The position is still winning for my opponent. I have fewer pieces, fewer pawns, and no obvious counterplay. If you were watching this game live, you'd think it was all but over for me. And then, my opponent plays bishop takes g3, taking my last knight. It looks like a perfectly natural move, picking up more material. But this is the move that loses the game. By capturing on g3, my opponent's bishop moves away from the critical diagonal, and suddenly there is a forced mate in 1 on the board. The evaluation flips completely, from a winning position for my opponent to a forced win for me in a single move. This is the kind of moment that makes chess so dramatic. One careless capture, and the entire game turns upside down. And I play queen to g7, checkmate. The queen lands on g7, and there is absolutely nothing my opponent can do. The king is trapped, the h6 pawn seals the escape, and the game is over. From a completely lost position to delivering checkmate, all because my opponent got greedy with that bishop capture instead of watching the back rank. So what's the lesson here? Honestly, I did not play a great game. I overextended on the king side with h5, lost material in the middle game, and was in a losing position for many moves. But I stayed in the game. I kept my queen active, and when my opponent made one careless capture, taking a piece that wasn't going anywhere instead of watching for threats, the entire game flipped. The takeaway is twofold. First, never resign too early. Especially in blitz, your opponent can always slip. And second, when you're winning, slow down. Check for your opponent's threats before you grab material. My opponent had this game won, and one move of inattention cost them everything. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to see more real games with honest analysis, the wins, the mistakes, and the lessons, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. I'll see you in the next game.